Hi, Misha here, and yet another helicopter for you. The Italian Agusta A-129 Mangusta. And I'm going to be comparing it with two very contemporary and exactly similar roll attack aircraft, the EC-665 Eurocopter, or Tiger, and, of course, the Hughes, later McDonnell Douglas, later yet Boeing AH-64 Apache. All three models are 1/72 scale diecast. The Apache is from Altea. The Mangusta is from Altea. And the Eurocopter is from Air Force One. I've done videos with Apaches using the Hobbymaster models, so just for a change up, I thought I'd use the Altea. Plus, this is 64A, and most all the other models are Ds. So, yeah. So this video is going to be two basic sections. First part, I'll talk about the A-129, and then the second part, I'm going to compare it kind of stat by stat to see how these three very similar helicopters stack up. Which one is perhaps quote-unquote better. First, though, Mangusta. We were talking to my wife before this. The plural of mongoose. You know, with goose at the end, you'd think it might be mongoose. But I also thought moose, so maybe it's like, you know, mongoose. And she thought maybe mongoose. It's actually mongooses, which is the most retarded sounding plural form I've ever heard of. Also, the name in general just seems really bizarre for a attack helicopter. And again, it doesn't sound any better in Italian. Mangusta. Yeah. Speaking of Italian, I'm not terribly picky about how people pronounce things, Lord knows, but around here in the South, some people say Italian, and that really bugs me. If they said Italy, I would at least kind of understand, but they still say Italy, so they know it's Italy, therefore Italian. But Italian is said so much around here, especially that Italian restaurant. Okay, I guess we'll get to the helicopter now, if you insist. Voice in my head. This is kind of a second-generation attack helicopter. The road is really paved, especially in the west, by Bell's AH-1 Cobra, which was basically a slimmed-down Huey. But by the 1970s, everyone was kind of thinking about the next generation, including Italy. The first kind of rumblings of the need for a dedicated attack helicopter, basically they wanted it for light reconnaissance and anti-armor, anti-tank. That started to be talked about in 1972. And at the same time, because of the Fulda Gap, West Germany was saying, hey, having a anti-armor helicopter that can take on tanks and other things would be great. So the two areas kind of discussed. Augusta and Italy was thinking about it, and so they kind of opened talks with Messerschmitt, MBB in West Germany. There's kind of a tentative idea to develop jointly an attack helicopter, but it didn't go anywhere. It fell apart. Germany went its own direction, and Italy continued on alone. they did think about just upgrading their existing A-109 helicopter, which was a utility passenger. And to some small extent they did, but really they went to an all-new design, which took longer. By 1978, they had officially begun the project, and the first of what will be 5 prototypes would fly on September 11th, 1983. Incidentally, the last of the 5 prototypes would take to the air in March of 1986. So with them in the air, people start to talk. Now by this point, the original Apache was in service. It entered into service in 1983, although its first flight was actually in 1975. So this was the one to compare it to. The Eurocopter wasn't even a glimmer yet. And a lot of publications and defense reviews and stuff at the time said basically Italy had produced something equivalent to the Apache, and of course far cheaper. The Italian army was highly interested, and Augusta was also hopeful for international contracts. And to help refine the design and with production, they started talking with Westland in the UK, who they'd had a relationship with, a pretty good one, ever since the 1950s when it comes to helicopters. And they even thought about bringing on some junior partners like Fokker in West Germany. So yeah, things were looking pretty good in 1984. In 1985, the Italian army pretty much said, yeah, we'd like to have around 60 at least to begin with. So with that in mind, after the 5th prototype flew, the Italians were pretty much geared and ready to go, and they were ramping up. But the international market and everyone else, it was kind of thought, let's take this and improve it and kind of make it more configurable, optional. So a memorandum of understanding, an agreement, was signed between the governments of Italy, United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Spain to kind of research and examine a joint project, kind of known as the Joint European Helicopter or the Light Attack Helicopter Program. And by 1988, they had examined quite a few designs. Single engine, double engine, different weapons packages. However, by 1989, the Cold War was winding down. The Berlin Wall came down. And so Britain and the Netherlands would go away. They would drop out. Actually, they would both end up going with the Apache. And I have done a video on the British Apache, made by Westland. So it was really just Spain and Italy, and the whole program just fell apart in 1990, with the end of the Cold War in 1991, leaving Augusta, again, alone. But they had taken notes, and they had kind of made an upgraded version known as the A-129i for international model. It was basically a strengthened version. It had a better gearbox, an improved transmission. It had upgraded engines. It had an electronics warfare suite, pretty good for the 1990s. It was more compatible with a wider range of weaponry. And they played with a new 5-bladed rotor, but also had 4 blades as an option. But the Italian army was still going with the original A-129, which they adopted as the AH-129A. And the helicopter started to be delivered in 1994. So what do we have here? I'm going to hold off on a lot of the specs until I can compare them, but just a brief kind of thing. It's a two-seater. It has 4 weapons pylons, 200 each stub wing. It has a 3-barrel 20mm cannon in the nose. The rear is a modification of the rear fuselage from the A-109, but the front, although it looks like an Apache and whatnot, is an all-new construction. This helicopter had a few firsts. It was the first attack helicopter to be 100% designed and manufactured anywhere in Europe. Pretty cool. It was also the first to have a 100% computerized systems, management system, which stores manage it, I guess I should say. Took some workload off the crew and just more accurate results. And this would be continually upgraded over its service life. Originally, it was always a 2-engine design. Like I said, they would do upgraded engines later. They also took some steps to make it not exactly stealthy, but to really, reduce its heat and IR signature. It also had a very good autopilot and other automatic controls, and was compatible with a wide range of weaponry, including Hellfire missiles, air-to-air missiles, rocket pods, and so on and so forth. It really seemed to be a good helicopter in the 1990s. It was first used by the Italian Army in various peacekeeping operations throughout the 1990s, for example, Somalia, former Yugoslavia, and acquitted itself quite well. And these are being delivered in batches. And they were getting towards the end of the 60-piece contract when in 1998 the Italian Army decided the last 15 would be manufactured essentially to the A-129I standard. So upgraded engines, the improved gearbox transmission, but they would retain the 4-bladed rotor. They would have enhanced electronic warfare suites, better situational awareness capabilities, so on and so forth. And so these would be first the 129C, and these would start to be delivered in 1999 by what had become Agusta-Westland, as the two companies had merged. And these were doing so well that in 2001, even before the order was completely done, the Italian Army decided to go ahead and upgrade their existing fleet to the new standard. And the first so-called remanufactured Mongoose appeared in 2002. And the process would continue for a few years as helicopters were rotated in and out of the service to get them the upgrade packages. And of course, the decision was taken right after the terror attacks in 2001, and so these were ready for service. Initially, 3 would be deployed to help coalition forces in 2003 in Iraq. And the helicopter again proved it was actually a very capable hot and dry operator. It seemed to do well in the heat and wasn't overly affected by the sand and dust. These would also go to Afghanistan. And continue on that way. In 2014, an improved model, the AH-129D, with more weapons compatibility with newer missiles like the Striker, would first be deployed to Afghanistan as well and prove itself. And while all new helicopters weren't ordered, at the beginning of 2015, an upgrade program was announced, basically to further automate the systems, have better compatibility, communications with newer aircraft, including unmanned aerial vehicles. And this program is scheduled to actually be complete this year. In one of the most recent combat deployments, 2016, a squadron of 4 Mangusta, I'm going to keep using that, I say Mangusta, sounds weird, along with 4 NH-90, which I have done a video on, were deployed together to operate in Iraq for search and rescue missions and also to defend strategic points. And otherwise, it just operated like your typical light attack helicopter. So it had not a huge order from the Italian Army, but successful. What about the international markets? Less successful, unfortunately. In 2000, Australia was working on getting a new attack helicopter. Of the half a dozen or so submissions that originally were given, the Mangusta was kind of down-selected, along with the Apache. I found these kind of pop up together a lot. And the Eurocopter. And things were looking pretty good for a time. But at the end of 2001, Australia announced it was going with the Eurocopter Tiger, the EC665. So the Mangusta lost out there. A few other nations looked at purchasing these, including Poland, but nothing really much came of it. That was more of a budgetary constraint than anything else. But one nation that has actually not only adopted the Mangusta, but also purchased a license to manufacture, is Turkey. They had been using older Bell AH-1 Cobras, and by the 1990s they really needed new helicopters. Their existing fleet had a lot of hours on it. It was getting expensive to maintain. So they started looking at the Mangusta and other helicopters pretty early, but it took a long time for them to make a decision. But finally, in 2007, they selected the A-129I, which that year was being renamed the AW-129 because it was. And they would initially purchase 51, and also a Turkish company, TAI, would get production rights not only for Turkey but also to export their variant. So the only real major user outside of Italy to date is Turkey, and that's probably where it's going to be. There's been talk about building 12 to 24 more of these for the Italians, but I don't think that's happened yet, and maybe never will. But on the other hand, they have done a very good job of keeping their fleet upgraded and modernized, if you can't tell. So even though they don't have that many, they seem to take good care of them. And since they're still in service, it must be a pretty durable helicopter. So that's where this one stands. But how does it stack up to its two rivals? I'm not going to go very deep into the history of the Apache because most of you probably know it better than me, and also I've already done at least 2 full videos. But you haven't seen this A model before, and yeah, I think there's some interesting parallels. Like the Mangusta, This dates back to 1972, and to replace the Cobra. The whole program was kind of fast-tracked, and the submission from Hughes Helicopters won in 1975. Flew in 1975 and won in 1976. And then a very protracted development phase would begin. They would actually change the engines out in 1981, and in 1982 full production was approved, and the first production model rolled off the assembly line in the latter half of 1983. So it took over a decade to get this out. And it wasn't actually until 1986 that deliveries to the U.S. Army, aside from like testing and pre-production, full production, full ready-to-go deliveries began. So the combat debut for the Apache was in 1989, the invasion of Panama. But of course it was the 1991 Gulf War, Operation Desert Storm, where this became hugely famous around the world, when half of the entire Apache fleet at the time was sent to escort and protect the ground forces taking back Kuwait. And all in all, it acquitted itself quite well. But it wasn't perfect, which led to the whole AH-64D, the longbow program, which throughout the 1990s tested itself and deliveries began, and then eventually it was decided to upgrade the entire fleet, and the last AH-64A was out of U.S. military service in 2012. Most of them weren't retired unless they were just heavily used. Most were upgraded to the new longbow standard. Of course, this was very much in service during the Second Iraq War, meaning it served right alongside the AH-129A. Now, interestingly, whereas the Mongoose had pretty good luck dealing with the heat and the sand and all that, in the first Gulf War, I'm not saying the Apache did horrible, but it definitely proved to be more maintenance intensive and more susceptible than they thought. Actually, to the point that it flew fewer hours than originally they had planned for. Just found that kind of interesting. Of course, with later subsequent versions, they would correct this. There was also a thought to perhaps replace some of these with the new RAH-66 Comanche, but that whole program was canned in 2004. Apache orders were increased, and this is still the primary attack helicopter in U.S. service, and many foreign services to date, including Britain, Japan, countless others. And they have made over 2,000 of these. So, a far cry from the, 100 and some odd that they made of the Mongoose. But, this is an Italian company, well now British Italian, versus a giant American conglomeration. Like I said, this would be originally made by Hughes, but in 1984 they'd be bought out by McDonnell Douglas, and then in 1997 they would merge with Boeing. So now the Apache is under the Boeing line, much like how the Mongoose started as an Agusta and then became Agusta-Westland. But yeah, very similar overall design. We have a cannon in the front. We have originally 4 hardpoints, although newer versions of the Apache also added wingtip hardpoints for Stinger missiles. Still has a crew of 2 engines. Very sophisticated, more so than the Mongoose, but also that means it is more maintenance intensive. Any helicopter is pretty maintenance intensive, so don't think any of them are that easy to maintain. But yeah, it's American, so it's bigger, badder, but also more expensive. It's the Apache. So what about the famous or infamous Tiger? And the Eurocopter Tiger. Again, I'm not going to go too deep into the history because I've already done one video on this, although maybe one day I'll go into more detail because it's a very colorful story. This is the youngest of the three. Kind of dates back to the mid-80s, around 1984. And the two primary movers and shakers were France, who had kind of, they had done their own thing in helicopters. I've done videos on the Puma, Super Puma, but they never had done strictly speaking, an attack helicopter like this. And they wanted one for close air support, escort of ground forces. West Germany, who had initially expressed interest in the Mangusta, well, it wasn't in the Mangusta then, you know what I mean. I should probably just say expressed interest in an attack helicopter, an anti-tank helicopter. Still was needing one. So yeah, these are the two driving forces, but other nations quickly, started to pay attention, including Spain. And really, as things were looking better for the Mongoose in 1986, as the agreement of understanding research was signed, things were looking pretty bad for the project here. Funding, which just wasn't there. By the way, at this point, the driving company was I can't talk. It's been a long day. Aerospatiale and France. But by 87, the need really, by this point, Germany really wanted that anti-tank helicopter to protect itself. Can't blame them given their position, and the Cold War was still going on. France was fighting quite a few wars in its former colonies and doing operations with NATO. So it was kind of back on, but the problem was they both wanted an attack helicopter, but kind of different focus. Nevertheless, an agreement was signed, and the project was moving ahead. And then the Cold War ended in 1991, and reunification of Germany really strapped the military hardcore on the budget front. And frankly, Germany, now unified, really wanted to pull out in 1992, but they really couldn't because of clauses in the various contracts. So instead, the new company known as Eurocopter was founded, and work proceeded. 5 prototypes were ordered, constructed, yada yada. Fast forward. We had already had one flying kind of pre-production prototype in 1991. They would go to more and more armed variants. But then they would keep running into all kinds of political, budget, construction issues. Again, arguing kind of over what it needed it for. Germany really was trying to figure out a new use because they didn't need an anti-tank helicopter, a dedicated one anymore, so they kind of reworked it to be more of a multi-role helicopter, still an attack, but less focused, more generalized. At any rate, both countries would order 80 helicopters each, and the first production model rolled off the assembly line in 2002, and then in 2003, deliveries began for military trials. By 2005, both France and Germany had Eurocopters to try out. Some issues were found, production things. There and again, though, other countries became interested and would get involved. Australia chose this at the end of 2001 as an example. Spain also chose it. By 2008, they were declared initially operational ready, and France would be the first to use these when it would deploy them to Afghanistan in 2009. Germany would also start to deploy them, but then they would find a wiring issue, yada yada. They had to be upgraded. By 2012, the upgraded German versions were in Afghanistan. Spain also would deploy some. France would tragically have one crash in 2011. This would be the first casualty. But things were rocking and rolling ahead finally after a long delay and huge budget overruns. But in the end, they ended up having a pretty capable attack helicopter. This was interesting because this was the first composite helicopter made in Europe. It too was a two-seater, twin-engine. Interestingly, unlike previous attack helicopters, the pilot would sit in the front and the gunner/navigator would be in the back seat. Although the controls were reversible, both could fly the helicopter. Also made training easier. It too had a cannon in the nose. 4 hard points, 2 under each wing. Has this mast on top, which is one of its most unique features. That's sensors. It's more geared to stealth than the other ones, but it's still a helicopter, so yeah, no. It's also more Navy-oriented, whereas the Apache is pretty much ground-based only, and the Mongoose, as far as I know, is ground-based only, but the Eurocopter does have variants that can operate from vessels, so that's a little special. And yeah, it's still in service today. I bet if you asked many people involved, they may not have done it all over again because the project ended up being much longer and more expensive than ever thought, but at least in the end they did end up with a capable helicopter. By the way, Eurocopter is now Airbus, so a 2 name change. Yada yada. Still in production. So, with kind of brief histories of those out of the way now, what about just putting these head-to-head, what they can do, can't do? And then also I'll wrap up, as usual, by talking briefly about the models. And then I'm going to go to bed. So, hitting the home stretch, guys. I didn't actually intend for this one to be especially long, but then I kind of got into it and found it fun. Had to keep myself from putting the Cobra on the table. But gotta draw the line somewhere. And of course, understanding that statistics are very subject to the exact engine and payload and operational environment. Also that I'm not a gearhead. I know it's shocking that a blind guy isn't really into engines and stuff, so forgive me. The Apache is our biggest guy. At nearly 49.5 feet long on the fuselage. The Mongoose is our littlest at about 40.25 feet long on the fuselage. And the Eurocopter, the Tiger, is right in the middle at a hair over 46 feet long. Speed-wise, the Apache's no slouch. It can do 182 miles max and likes to cruise around 165, give or take version and engine, of course. The Mongoose is our slowest, although it's nothing to be ashamed of. It's capable of getting to about 173 miles per hour, and it likes to cruise at about 150. So slower, but not disgustingly so. And the Eurocopter, is actually the fastest, or potentially so. When it has the mast on top, it can match the Apache. And without the mast, it can get up to about 195 miles per hour. And it likes to cruise at about the same 160 to 170 miles per hour. As far as armaments, which is obviously the most important for an attack helicopter, they're very similar. The Apache has a 30mm cannon under the nose, and depending on the version, it can carry anywhere from 700 to 1200 rounds of ammunition for it, so it's packing some heat. The Mangusta has a 3-barrel Gatling type cannon, and it carries 500 rounds total, but it is only, and I kind of jokingly, a 20mm. Although there is a version, one of the upgrades, the CBTC, which was the version they upgraded to in the early 2000s, they could actually have a 50 caliber machine gun pod instead. Smaller projectile, but many more rounds. And the Eurocopter returns to using a 30mm cannon, but it holds the fewest rounds at 450. But again, it is 30 caliber again. Initially, all three of these had 4 hard points, 2 under each stub wing, but as I said, the Apache newer versions added 2 additional hard points, 1 on each stub wing. Now these couldn't just take anything, they were pretty much reserved for Stinger missiles, so for defense. And of course, the Apache is most famously known for its Hellfire missiles. And it can also carry rocket pods and air-to-air missiles if needed for defense. Very various ones depending on which nationality. The Mangusta doesn't have the wing tips. It can carry Hellfire missiles as well, but it can only carry up to 8, whereas the Apache can carry up to 16 if you really load her down, although I don't know how advisable that would be. It can also alternatively carry 4 Mistral air-to-air missiles. It can carry the Strike missile. Pretty much anything. And both the inner and outer hardpoints are capable of carrying essentially the same weight. And the Eurocopter may have the widest range of missile selections just based on what it is, but again, it's the same thing, basically. Hellfire missiles, Strike missiles, Mistrals, Hot missiles, which is something that France and Germany have used for a long time. One thing that's a little interesting, the inner hardpoint seems to have a little bit higher weight allowance than the outer hardpoint. The inner hardpoints are rated for 4 clusters of Hellfires, but the outers are not. The outers are used more for kind of defense, like on the wingtips of the Apache, for example, Stinger missiles. You can even see on this model that the inners have a cluster of 4 and the outers have 2. But all things considered, you know, they're all pretty well loaded for bear. But the mongoose is the lightest of these, smallest. And the one that's been produced in the smallest numbers, to be fair. But, I mean, you can really see this, the whole design similarity. I mean, the cockpits are almost virtually identical, especially on the mongoose and the tiger. Heck, they're even both named after felines. Really are just interesting attack helicopters, very specialized for what they do. As far as the models themselves, I've made my opinions clear. The Altea Apache is not as nice, of course, as the Hobby Master, but then again, it costs less than half the money, and it's still very good for what you get. And again, it's an original A. I think I'm pointing at the wrong one. Actually, I think I picked the wrong ones up for these. Oh well. You guys know what I meant. Yeah, I put the Apache in the middle. I do apologize, guys. These things happen, but you know what I meant. It's the A, you can tell, because it has the little top. Doesn't have the big ball on it, which I think is neat, and it doesn't have the wingtips. On the Altea models, the landing gear are fixed down, but it doesn't matter on these because they're down anyway. There's no crew figures, but they're nice for what they are. Really are. The Air Force One, it too isn't quite up to Hobby Master or even really Corgi, but it's definitely a little higher than Altea. For one thing, it comes with a very nice metal stand. They all do. And the Air Force One models tend to be pretty weighty. They tend to use a high amount of metal, which is funny considering this was a composite aircraft, so I joke that it has more metal in it than the original. Landing gear do rotate for whatever that's worth. Of course, the blades rotate on all of these, and Air Force One does put pilot figures in their aircraft, at least generally speaking. I'll try to get in there and see. I assume this one does. The cockpits do not open on these, so I can't reach in to feel, but I know most of the aircraft they do. And this one has removable ordnance, whereas the Alteas do not. So, a little more features, a little more detail. I love the texture on this. Even though it's metal, they kind of coated it to make it feel like a synthetic. It almost feels like it's a metal frame that's been sprayed with, like, it's not truck bed liner, but you know what I mean, that kind of plastic, rubbery, not rubber overmold. It feels really neat. I like this model a lot. A lot. But yeah, 172 scale helicopters are really neat. I like this Altea. It's very heavy. It's obviously the biggest of the three. For some reason, it has missiles under the wingtips, but it doesn't seem fully loaded down, which is okay. Not every helicopter was. Yeah, it seems like the outer station is not occupied on this one, which I guess, I mean, it's just how they ship them. I'm just glad they give ordnance at all. But if you look at the mongoose here, they actually give clusters, rocket pod, and whatnot. But yeah, when it comes to helicopters, I think Altea is pretty great. Now, if you're wanting British helicopters, then you go to Corgi, because they've got that nailed down. Alrighty, guys. I appreciate you hanging out with me here. Hope you enjoyed kind of my look at the replacements for the Cobra. I just think these are so neat. If you have any questions or comments, please do post them below. And as always, if you could like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I will catch you very soon in another, hopefully not too boring video. Thanks, guys. See you then.